Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. I'm your host, Gabriel Andrade, broadcasting from Maracaibo, Venezuela. And joining me today on the other end of the line is Darrell Ray. He is the author of the book God and Sex, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. Hello, Darrell. Welcome.
Well, my pleasure. Glad to be on here. Just one minor correction. It's sex and God.
Sex and God. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes. Sex always comes first, you know.
Right, indeed. Well, how does religion distort sex or sexuality?
Well, it starts from the day you're born as you get messages about your body. And almost all religions tell us we are failed and flawed and sinful and corrupt. And, you get all those messages, even from the day you're born practically, including things like circumcision. Of course, that's a religious concept in many cultures. Down to you shouldn't masturbate, you shouldn't touch yourself, that you're unclean as a result of being born of Adam. That kind of stuff creates a sense of self-hate and body image issues in people from the very beginning. I mean, how many people are taught that virginity, for example, is important, and yet virginity is a religious concept designed to oppress women and keep women pure. The whole concept of purity in women is a religious concept, largely.
Right.
So, if women and men are being told from very early on that any kind of sex is bad until you're married, then that's distorting. Because there's lots of cultures on this planet that don't require that, and most cultures worked just fine for thousands of years before Christianity and Islam and Hinduism came along to repress them.
Right. Well, in your book, there are many obvious points. For instance, masturbation. I mean, we can both agree that that's not going to kill anybody, and it's just an obsession that religion has with that. But I want to go back to circumcision, because you have said that, and you say in the book that this is mostly a religious concern, but that's not how the public opinion has it. The public opinion has it that there is a scientific consensus that circumcision is actually good because of hygiene and, all sorts of reasons. And up until a few decades ago, physicians, whether they were religious or not, they would recommend circumcision. I'm circumcised, and my parents were not particularly religious. Now, can you clarify that for us? I mean, is circumcision good or not for you?
Yeah, I can clarify it. First of all, there is no good science that says circumcision has any kind of major health benefits. None whatsoever. There's a lot of junk science out there, but there's no good science. There's some really bad science out of Africa talking about the spread of HIV. And men are being pushed into getting circumcised that don't need to be circumcised. And just think about this. Your body was born with a foreskin. For millions of years, we've existed quite well with a foreskin. There must not be too many hygienic problems, or we wouldn't have survived so well as a species. It's pretty obvious that the science is wrong there.
Well, but hold on there for a sec. I mean, It seems to me you're getting into a naturalist fallacy. We have an appendix. Having an appendix is not good for us. I mean, it can cause a lot of problems. We have wisdom teeth. Having wisdom teeth is not good for us. Sometimes, most of the time, dentists have to take them out. I mean, how is the part of the penis that comes out in circumcision any different?
Well, for one, we do not know how many circumcisions are botched, go wrong, create big problems. But right now, there's an entire penis reconnecting penis movement in South Africa for men whose circumcisions have gone wrong. And they say up to 250 men in South Africa lose their penis every year because of circumcision. Well, the fact is, there are similar problems in the United States. Do you know who's doing the circumcisions in most hospitals? It's the brand new doctor who can't do anything else. The youngest person's doing them. It's a bizarre and barbaric practice. It's just as barbaric in whether it's for religious purposes or not. But in the United States and in the West, in Europe, most people are not circumcised. Even to this day, they're not, and they don't understand why we do that. Where did this come from? in the United States, I don't know about Venezuela, but in the United States, men were not circumcised on the whole until about the 1920s. And it was a direct result of a very religious man called Dr. Kellogg. You probably heard of him, of Kellogg's cereal.
Yes, of course.
He was a married man that was probably celibate, never had sex in his life, and was very anti-sexual. And his notion was if you circumcise boys, they won't masturbate. That was his theory. And he pushed this theory in the early 1900s, from about 1895 to 1920. And as hospitals grew and developed as the place for birthing of children, he was able to train doctors to circumcise. So you've got a centralization of the medical field into hospitals. You know, kids weren't being born in homes after 1920 or so. More and more kids are being born where the doctors could get their hands on them, and circumcision started happening. So circumcision was a religious idea propagated by a very deeply religious man in the United States, Dr. Kellogg, who started the Kellogg cereal company. And it was his mission in life to stop boys from masturbating because he thought it was sinful and would cause them to, harm their marriage. So, yes, it's a deeply religious concept that got infected into our culture. Now, your parents weren't religious, but that doesn't mean they weren't influenced by that religious idea. Where ideas come from can oftentimes be irrelevant. Once they get into a culture, they can take on a life of their own.
Right. So but at least in the case of my parents, they always had the idea, and hopefully I only have girls, so I didn't have to go through this decision. But in the case of my parents, they always had the idea that this was a scientific idea because, you could see doctors with white robes on TV saying that this was actually beneficial for health, not because of the masturbation reason that you're giving, but more because of hygiene, right. Because the accumulation of dirt in the male organ.
Well, that's the new theory. That's the new idea. That wasn't why Dr. Kellogg started it, and it wasn't why people were saying it back then. But are men in Europe, do they have poor hygiene? Do men in China have poor hygiene? I can't believe that. That just doesn't make any sense. Why would it suddenly be better for Christian culture or Western cultures, especially the United States and the Western Hemisphere, be better and more hygienic than men in Europe? I doubt it. If you went to a man in Europe that was not circumcised and says, "Are you unhygienic because you're not circumcised?" he'd probably call you crazy because there's no evidence for it. A good shower is all you need. If you're worried about it, just take a bath.
Right,
it's pretty simple.
Right.
Now you're cutting off a hugely important part of the organ that has tons and tons of nerve endings that adds tons of pleasure for men. It has a function. It has a clear function. So let's not mess with it any more than we should be circumcising women. Now,
women are obviously a different matter because, over there you can see that it's much more traumatic to the point that, they barely enjoy the sexual act. I don't want to get too much into details here. I am circumcised, but I don't think I'm missing out a great part of my sexuality to the best of my knowledge. And this is what I want to ask you. Was I robbed of a lot of pleasure because of being circumcised?
I don't know. I'm circumcised too. I wouldn't know. I just know that men who have them don't seem to have a problem with it. They like it a lot.
Right. Now, here's another question. Yeah. This is more philosophical, going again with a circumcision. There's the idea that if these philosophers, especially utilitarian philosophers, sometimes discuss this. If you don't remember something, where is the harm? No one remembers what happened to them during the first month of their lives. And yes, babies scream when they get these surgeries, but where's the harm? After all, neither you nor I remember what actually went on.
Well, there's a clear answer to that. Every human being should have bodily integrity. You should have a choice over your own body. Parents should only have a choice if there is a clear, life-threatening need for an operation or surgery. No Parents should not be allowed to mutilate their children, whether they're boys or girls. If you ask, the same thing could be applied to female genital mutilation if we did it by the time they're a month old. So I think we could all agree that would be wrong, couldn't we?
But what about earrings, for instance? I pierced my little girl's ears so that when they grew up, their earring would fit better. That's obviously a mutilation. No one seems to complain.
Well, I don't see that as devastating. It's not taking something away from somebody, and if she doesn't want to wear earrings, she doesn't have to. But once you cut that foreskin off, you've made a life-changing decision for somebody. That's the key.
All right. Well, enough with circumcision, because that's not the only part of your book. So there are many other points that I want to get to. Throughout your book, there are plenty of points. Throughout your book, the target of your criticism is mostly the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and some Bible stories too. Now, if you read the pages of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, I don't think there is this obsession against sex. I mean, there are many wonderful sexual stories in the Bible, and there's a famous book by an author, a Jewish author, Jonathan Kirch, and the name of the book is The Bible Sex Stories. And, he tells many of those wonderful stories. For instance, Judah, he goes with his daughter-in-law Tamar dressed as a prostitute. And, the Bible doesn't seem to make a great deal out of this.
It makes a big deal out of it unless you're picking and choosing. Remember, women are unclean for a minimum of 1 week and probably 2 weeks. Within Judaism, it has been since 1,000 years BCE. When a woman has a menstrual cycle, she is considered unclean. She may not be touched by a man. If she is touched by a man, and this is true today in Orthodox Judaism, it still is. If she's touched by a man, he must go get himself cleansed. He has to take a special ritual to cleanse himself. Now, wait a minute. Isn't that a pretty sex-negative notion that women are unclean for 2 weeks out of every month? That's strong.
Of course, I agree. But my point is that in telling the stories, they don't seem to put away the issue, the Bible authors, at least the Hebrew Bible authors. They present the stories as they thought they happened, and they're not under any certain censorship.
Oh, I think the sexual mores are different for sure between Christianity and Islam, Judaism for sure, but they're both sex negative. They're just sex negative in different ways. If you're not a virgin when you get married as a Jew, you're unclean. There's a big problem in Judaism. And there's a big problem in Christianity, too, with the notion that a woman should be a virgin when she gets married. That's a pretty sex-negative message. Also, Jews are not particularly happy about masturbation. It's against the Orthodox Jews, Jewish tradition to masturbate.
Right.
Now, there are some Jewish groups, like the Reforms, that really don't care. But I'm talking about the ones that base their stuff on the Bible. And remember, women can be stoned to death if they're not a virgin on their wedding night in the Old Testament. That's pretty clear, too. There's entire stories of that. There's stories of men raping women because they were seen as unclean or needed to be punished by somebody.
Right.
Oh, no, there's a lot of sex-negative stories, but you can pick and choose and find some so-called good stories in the Bible. I don't think Judaism's any more sex-positive. See, I've been getting ready to interview for my podcast. I have a podcast called Secular Sexuality Podcast. Mm-hmm. Getting ready to interview two former Orthodox Jews, a man and a woman. Now, they don't know each other. And the story I'm getting from them is horrendous. I mean, the treatment of women within Orthodox Judaism, they're just one step above cattle. Even in New York City. And men have total control over their daughters. They tell their daughters when they can get married, how they can get married. If they're not a virgin when they get married, then they're a shame to the whole family. It's very much like Islam because the two religions, Judaism and Islam, come out of the same patriarchal and pastoral roots. But you also mentioned that in my book, I think there's one thing, I do talk quite a bit about other religions like Hinduism. I talk about tribal religions as well in South America, especially in the Amazon. I don't just focus on the Abrahamic religions. I do deal with Buddhism as well, and Buddhism is a very sex-negative religion, despite what people might say. It's very patriarchal, very male-focused. I can find no none of the major religions are sex positive. None. Now, there are some small religions, like Wicca or pagan, that are fairly sex positive, but the major ones are not.
But what about Hinduism? I mean, we have all this image of the Kama Sutra as you know, the
Right.
text that promotes free sexuality and so forth.
Right. I do talk about Hinduism extensively in one chapter, and I talk about how sex positive India was in probably about the 700 to 900s, and that's why we have these beautiful temples with all the sexual imagery on them. But the fact is, India is the 148th worst country in the world to be a woman. They're ranked 148 in treatment of women. That is terrible. Hinduism is extremely sex negative and extremely oppressive to women. And you see the rape culture in India where gangs of men have raped women right on a bus. And it takes a huge outcry to even get them prosecuted. And they oftentimes get off with nothing. The police don't pursue those men or the rape allegations by women. Hinduism had turned out to be a very sex negative religion because it became so patriarchal.
Right.
And there's probably some influence of Islam on Hinduism as well, because large parts of India, even those parts that remained Hindu, oftentimes were governed by Islamic rulers. And the Islamic rulers brought their extremely sex negative and oppression of women philosophy into Hinduism.
Well,
so there's some crossover between those religions.
Right. To further your point, I would argue here that there's a lot of cherry picking too in Hinduism, because in the same manner that when one reads the Bible and one reads a book such as the Song of Songs, you know, which is very erotic, and one can think, well, the Bible is very sex positive, but then you argue, no, but there are many other stories that, you know, are much more prominent. And, you know, the Song of Songs is only a minority in the Bible. I think it's the same in Hinduism. I mean, yes, there is the Kama Sutra, but there are many other stories where women are degraded. And I think, for instance, of the Ramayana, which is one of the great epics. When the king comes back after his great epic, his wife is suspected of being adulterous. And, you know, she has to go through some ordeal to prove that she was loyal to the king. So in this case, I mean, I think there's a lot of cherry picking. I guess religious believers do this all the time, right? I mean, whenever critics point out how bad the religion is, they say, well, but there's this minor part that, you know, that disproves what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'm less interested in what their holy books say and more interested in what they actually do. I want to look at the actual practices. I don't care if their holy book was totally sex positive. If they're still oppressing women, if they're still telling women that they must be virgins when they get married, if they're telling men that their bodies are impure and they're unclean from birth, though that's not sex positive. I don't care what your scriptures say. It's the practice that's more important.
Well, but sometimes they claim, sometimes I've heard the arguments done by some clerics, especially from Islam, when they say, well, but we have to separate traditional beliefs and practices from religion. So, yes, maybe in East Africa there's female circumcision, but that's not the fault of Islam. That was there before Islam got there. So, I mean, we do have to separate practices from what the holy books say. That's their argument.
Right. They do say that, and then they promptly forget that Muhammad didn't prohibit female sexual circumcision any more than Jesus prohibited slavery or Paul prohibited slavery. They did not. So you've got an endorsement of something because they were silent on it. And Muhammad actually said, in his own words in the Hadith, don't cut too deeply, as he was literally watching a girl be circumcised. I mean, that's in the Hadith. So, yes, they say it's not a part of Islam, but it is a part of Islam because Muhammad himself didn't forbid it. He only gave rather poor advice on it.
Right.
As well, yeah.
Now, what about the argument pursued by cultural relativists that say, well, each culture has its own way of being. This is almost Western imperialism, you know, Western modern imperialism that tries to tell the traditional religion not to do this, not to do that. You have to respect each culture. And I think we've seen this with the recent tragedies of Charlie Hebdo in Paris and other cases where, more Muslim traditionalists. But this is not only done by Muslims, it's also done by Catholics and some Protestants and some Jews. When they say, you are doing an imperialist act if you pretend to impose your sexual morality on other cultures.
Yeah, I don't have any problems with it. I'm not a cultural relativist. I'm a humanist, and I think human beings are number one priority, and they take priority over culture and religion and traditions. A humanist says the individual is important. The individual should have say over their own bodies. If you want to go and pray for 5 hours a day, I don't care. But to try and force another human being on to do that because of some dogma that you've got is ridiculous. And that's what these religions, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, what they're all trying to do. And so I am not a cultural relativist. I think humanism has a standard upon which we can measure a lot of things.
Right. Well,
I mean, how do we know? Without humanism, how do we know that slavery is wrong? No, none, not one of the major religions condemns slavery. Almost all of them endorse slavery in some way. So is it wrong? I mean, using cultural relativism, we could say, well, okay, they have slaves in Nigeria, or they have slaves in Dubai, so that's not a problem because that's a part of their culture. That is wrong. That's my estimation. We've got a pretty clear standard, and that standard comes from humanism. There's no Christian doctrine, there's no Muslim doctrine, there's no Hindu doctrine against slavery. So that's my argument.
Well, fair enough. We've covered so far circumcision, masturbation. I mean, it's obvious that religion has it wrong there, and I agree with you. What about pornography?
Pornography has been around since humans have been around. And it's only an issue because the religionists bring it up. There's huge myths about pornography. There's huge myths about it being terrible or bad or whatever. What we know is about 93% of all men use pornography actively at some point in their life, and about 70% of women use pornography actively at some point in their life. Men are usually peaking out at 21 years of age, where women peak out at about 30 years of age in their use of pornography. If pornography was so bad, then the whole culture, the whole world would be falling apart. But there's lots of evidence. In fact, there's a brand new study that just came out this week that says men who use pornography are more sexually interested and more sexually active within their marriages than men who don't use pornography. And this really supports some of my own research. In my research as a psychologist, I've worked with couples and people for years. And what I've noticed is if you're a very, very religious couple married, you're probably in a sexless marriage by about 10 years. Probably 80 to 90% of deeply religious married couples are not having regular sex by the time they've been married 10, certainly by 15 years.
Right.
And that's a huge complaint because just because you're not having sex doesn't mean you don't have a sex drive. You don't want sex.
Right.
But religion says you can only have sex certain ways. You can only have a missionary position or you're violating God. You can't masturbate. You're violating God. You can't have oral sex or you're violating God. So if you stop or prohibit all these creative ways of having sex, it gets pretty boring after a while. Like, you can only eat steak for the rest of your life. Well, you get tired of steak. And that's what happens in religious couples because they are so prohibited. I've had many a man or many women come in and say, I would love to have more sex with my husband, but he won't do it except this one way and only so many times a week or so many times a month. And there's just no creativity there.
Right.
Well, with
this issue of pornography, I find it very bizarre that the religious right has an alliance with the feminist left. Because, I mean, it's also feminists and very left-wing feminists who say that pornography is bad for you and, it causes rape and so forth.
Yeah. Well, there's no evidence that it causes rape. In fact, there's some evidence that it might mitigate sexual criminal behavior. There's a number of studies that show where pornography was pornography restrictions were loosened, crime went down. There's a Japanese study in that, and there's a Croatian study in that. Right. So there's actually no. The myth goes clear back to the 1970s and 80s when the religious right was first getting started in the United States, that pornography created or caused rape. No evidence whatsoever for that at all.
All right.
If you think about it.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Final thought.
Expressing yourself sexually is a human thing, and all religion does to the equation is try to restrict it.
All right.
Always in the interest of growing the religion.
All right, Professor or Dr. Darrell Ray. He's the author of Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. Thank you so much for taking our call, sir.
My pleasure, Gabriel. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right.